Hey, welcome to Honey, I Shrunk the Kitsch. One of the things I love about the Victorian era is these beautiful crazy quilts that were so popular. I'm going to make a miniature version of a Victorian crazy quilt for my dollhouse. And while I do, let's talk a little bit about how these incredibly beautiful, kind of bonkers quilts came to be. So since I already have this panel of fabric that has some little Victorian crazy quilts printed onto it, I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of embroidery to the top to bring out some of those details. So I'm going to choose the lighter red here, and we'll start in the middle, as we always do when we're doing needlework. And I'm going to get started adding a little bit of fancy work. Now, when I was a little girl and I first saw an example of a Victorian era crazy quilt, it was hanging up in an antique shop, and I was just fascinated by the beautiful stitches that were on it. It was very much like this pattern here. The patches were all different sizes, all different kinds of fabrics, and then they had these, chain stitches and zigzag stitches and tassels and things. And I just could not figure out how this thing was holding itself together. Well, come to find out, a lot of these crazy quilts are actually foundation pieced, meaning that there is a large block of a plain fabric like muslin, something sturdy and kind of utilitarian. And then the quilter would sew these fancy patches onto that foundation fabric. And these embellishment stitches are just that. They're not structural at all, they're just there to add beauty. And that really gets into what a crazy quilt is. This is not really intended to be a utilitarian kind of patchwork quilt, but as a piece of art. Now, I've already used the word Victorian a few times here, and I just need to take a minute and say that when we talk about the Victorian era, it's a lot like when you turn on the radio and it says that it's playing the top hits from the 80s, 90s, and today. That is a 45-year span. And I have myself been alive for most of those years and all of those decades. And I can tell you that there is a big difference between listen to like Mr. Brightside versus listening to um, Cyndi Lauper versus listening to Blink 182. There is a pretty big range in the tastes and the style of the Victorian era as well. And a lot of that in Great Britain probably comes down to the person for whom the Victorian era is named, Queen Victoria. She had a very long reign from a little before 1840. I think it's 1837 until 1901 when she passed. She became queen when she was just about 18, was a new bride and a new mother within a few years, and enjoyed a very long and happy marriage to Prince Albert during that time. I'm going to take a quick minute here to interrupt my pontificating about Victorian history to talk about the stitches that I'm doing here. This is the satin stitch, and I'm using it to embellish this. I think it's an H. I'm not positive if this is intended to be an H, but for my purposes, I'm going to try and turn it into an M. And anyhow, I'm going to use a satin stitch to do it. So I'm going to fill in this whole letter with satin stitches, and it's going to give a really cool little texture, almost like it's made out of ribbon. And while I'm doing that, let's head back to talk about the Victorian era. The earlier part of the Victorian era, like 1830s through 1860s maybe, is more so defined by that really opulent, more is more, gild the lily kind of aesthetic. And to be clear, that kind of opulence at the beginning of the Victorian era is about class, it's about status, it's about wealth. And we do see those factors starting to change a lot towards the end of the 1800s. But there are some elements of Victorian style that stay pretty consistent throughout the entire era. Victorians are always seeking beauty and they are intensely curious. They are looking to other cultures and copying things that they find beautiful and incorporating that into their artwork. And they're also looking into the natural world and bringing in a lot of natural influences to their art. So, one of the things that you're going to see a lot in Victorian artwork, and especially you'll see them in Victorian crazy quilts, is floral motifs, like the one that's on this initial here. So while I'm wrapping up the satin stitching, let's talk about how we're going to fill this in. I'm thinking that I am going to use a series of French knots, and I'm going to try and match the colors as closely as I can. But we see a lot of French knots in embroidery and crazy quilts, and I've always really enjoyed them, and I somewhat enjoy making them. So let's see if doing 50 to 100 of them on this piece will warm me up to it even a little more. So, what is it that starts to shift the aesthetic and sort of shift the style of the Victorian times in the late 1800s? For Queen Victoria herself, I would probably say that it's grief. In about 1860, she loses her mother, and in 1861, she loses her husband, Prince Albert, who is only in his early 40s at the time, and they were very much in love. So Queen Victoria enters a state of deep mourning. She wears dark colors really for the rest of her life, mourning the love of her life. Um, and over here in America, there's something else that's happening in 1861 through 1865. Obviously, we're going through the American Civil War. And while you do see crazy quilts during that time, they don't really start to become the craze that they are until the 1880s. And that's true really in both Great Britain and America, which I think is so interesting that the 1880s are really when you see this style of artwork starting to explode. So, from the 1860s through the 1880s in Great Britain and also in the United States, we definitely see a big shift from this idea of trying to always serve the highest class and more about making beauty accessible to everyone. For example, a very famous textile maker from this time, the 1870s and 1880s, named William Morris, he is the one who coined the phrase, have nothing in your home that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. And to me, I really think that that perspective is what made crazy quilting become the fad that it was. These beautiful materials that are so often used in this, like bits of velvet, bits of silk, are a lot more accessible now to the middle class than they ever would have been before. Now that ordinary people have access to these gorgeous materials, they're going to make works of art. So we see a lot of symbolism. One of my favorite details in a lot of Victorian crazy quilts is that they'll have a spider web or they'll have a spider just like the one here. Now I'm going to highlight this on my piece by doing an outline stitch with just a single strand of this gold colored thread. Now, I have to tell you, I appreciate spiders for their role in the ecosystem. I like them in my garden. I can't say that I am excited when I meet them face to face, and I for sure would not choose to embroider them on anything, really. But Victorians were crazy about this as a good luck symbol. Even from the beginning of the Victorian era, you see a lot of naturalists talking about spiders as an example of industry, and you can see how it would really take off while their human counterparts are going through a lot of industrialization themselves. But even outside of the practical nature of how a spider spins their web so quickly and how ornate and beautiful they are, you also see a lot of spiders reflected in folklore and mythology from around the world. In Greek mythology, you have Arachne, who shows up the goddess Athena and is clearly the better spinner and weaver. And Athena, being the gracious loser she always is, turns her into a spider so that she is cursed to weave beautiful webs forever. And we know that Victorian style and Victorian architecture was influenced by a lot of classical pieces. So maybe Arachne played a role in the popularity of spiders. But they also appear in other cultures, such as Japan. So in the 1860s in Japan, we also have the ending of the Edo period and the beginning of the Meiji era. The Meiji era in Japan is also typified by rapid industrialization, by more cultural exchange with other parts of the world. In fact, some United States historians really look to the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876, where there was this huge exposition, the Japanese Pavilion, that displayed thousands and thousands of works of Japanese culture and Japanese art and really had a pretty incredible impact on art and style and apparently in quilting. One of the aesthetics of the Japanese artwork that really caught on was the crazed look of that crackled glaze on some of the pottery. And maybe that's where the term for crazy quilting and that asymmetrical but balanced kind of look to the piece really came from. And of course, there were also a lot of natural motifs in Japanese art at that time as well, including, you guessed it, spiders on webs. Also, around this period in Japan, very recently, towards the end of the Edo period, there had been a character or a legend called Jorogumo, which is basically a spider woman, a very beautiful woman who maybe lures a handsome young man into her lair and then, eats him. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that Jorogumo was maybe not the origin of spiders and spider webs being thought to be good luck charms, or maybe they were, I don't know. But there were definitely a lot of superstitions about spiders and luck going on throughout the Victorian era. Um, very little black spiders, if you saw them, those were money spinners, and they would bring good luck to you, or they would be a sign of increasing fortune, or they might be thought to be good luck for someone who sews, someone who quilts. I don't know that Arachne would have agreed with that necessarily, but all the same, in these Victorian era crazy quilts, you do see a lot of spider and spider web motifs. And I've enjoyed stitching on this one. I think it's kind of cool for historical reasons. I don't know that I would adopt it for other projects, but all the same, it was fun to do. And in natural symbolism that I find slightly less horrifying than spiders, there's a lot of secret code or secret meaning in the language of the flowers. So there's more floral motifs here on this miniature crazy quilt that I'm embroidering. And I'm going to use a blanket stitch just around the edges here, very much like it looks like it's printed onto the cloth, just to kind of give the impression that maybe this is an applique that was put on and to add some dimension there. Now, pansies are typically meant to symbolize thoughts. They are named after the French verb penser, meaning to think. Glad to know I am now using the French I studied for 6 years. But you even see that in Shakespeare and Hamlet when Ophelia is like, and here's pansies, that's for thoughts. So that would have been a popular addition to little tussy mussies that they had in the Victorian era, and also in little appliques that people would have put on their crazy quilts. Another symbol you'll see pretty often in crazy quilts are shafts of wheat, which symbolize life. In the shape of the cross, it symbolizes, the Eucharist, the Christian concept of the bread of life. And we also see butterflies. I'm going to embroider the butterfly here rather than the wheat, partly because I'm afraid that if I embroider such a large piece on this side of what I want the finished quilt to be, I think it's going to be too stiff for me to be able to lay it and drape it the way I want in the dollhouse. But Victorians definitely had a love for butterflies as well. And in case history has led you astray into believing that we merely mounted butterflies or preserved them under little glass domes as a curiosity in the Victorian parlor, let me tell you, they actually wore a great deal of insect jewelry, sometimes dead, sometimes alive. That was a fad too in the Victorian era. Victorian ladies might actually wear preserved butterflies on a ball gown or put lightning bugs in their hair to make it sparkle. Or they might even have a live lizard that was on a leash and pinned to their bodice, or a live beetle that was in a little golden cage also pinned to their dress. So, really disturbing trend, no word yet on whether that little fashion statement extended to their love of spiders and spider webs too. But all the same, whatever your opinion on various insects, I would definitely rather embroider them than wear them. And on that somewhat bizarre note, we are coming to the end of how much I'm actually going to be embroidering this piece because it is a miniature. And from a practical standpoint, I can't add too much without risking making it too thick to be able to drape well. So I really like the way that this has turned out. I think we added just enough embroidery to add some dimension without making it too stiff. So the next thing that we are going to do is cut out this little square and add a backing. Since Victorian crazy quilts are so heavily embroidered, and because they were really meant to be works of art, maybe you would have it in the parlor, or it might be draped over the settee, or maybe hanging up on the wall like a tapestry. So they typically didn't have a layer of cotton batting in the middle, the way that most patchwork quilts do, because they weren't really intended usually to be a bed quilt. We do see that kind of change towards the end of the trend, especially if it's a piece that's made mostly out of cottons, or if it doesn't have a lot of beadwork or, peacock feathers or whatever sewn onto it. So because of that, because I wasn't going to add a batting, I thought I would be safe to back it with a thicker fabric, like this piece of red velvet. And boy, was that a mistake. It ended up being much thicker than I wanted. You see, when I fold it, it just springs right back in place. So I ended up having to take out my seam ripper and try again with this bit of blue satin as the backing instead. I can already tell the drape on this is going to be much nicer, but I don't love working with satin, so I went ahead and treated the raw edges all the way around with a healthy amount of fray check. And after that fray check had completely dried, I was able to turn it right side out through this little space that I left while I was stitching all the way around. I was able to do that without the satin absolutely shredding and making me crazy. So after I did that, I was able to close this little opening with a disappearing stitch or an invisible stitch. And I just ironed it to try and get those edges really nice and even. And now it is ready to go. I'm so pleased with how this piece turns out, and especially with how it's going to look in my Victorian era dollhouse. Thank you so much for joining me for this long and intensely fun project of making a miniature Victorian era crazy quilt. And if you enjoyed this, I really hope that you'll stick around, press subscribe, and even press that little bell icon so you'll get the alert next time I upload something miniature related, or maybe even another mini history lesson. Thanks so much for watching.